Friary of the Holy Cross. You go to the Dominicans Church in High Street in Sligo today, and it's the Friary of the Holy Cross. So there was a large wooden cross right on top of the roof screen, and away in the distance you see the biggest window in the church. That's the east window. Sun rises in the east, shines in through the big window in the morning. The priest will probably say it's a symbol of the resurrection, the rising sun. The altar is at the east end of the church. All Christian burials lined up east-west. But I always tell people, everything here that has a religious explanation, it usually has a very practical explanation as well. And the Dominicans, the friars here, they knew how to make maximum use of the sun. You see this as you go through their buildings and various aspects of it. We have star architects today telling us how we should design our houses and so forth. So should listen to the Dominicans. They were doing it all hundreds of years ago. In fact, the Dominicans and friars like them were doing a lot of the stuff that we think is sophisticated today. We had a lecturer one time in one of our classes, and the first lesson he gave us was he did not want to hear the word unsophisticated used in relation to any ancient peoples or people that had gone before us, because we were making a judgment, and sometimes those people were maybe as sophisticated, if not more, than ourselves. But anyways, the sun shone on the east side, shone in through the big window, and of course it illuminated the window and illuminated the church in the morning. And if you can picture walking in here in the morning, you see the sun shining in through the big east window. The huge wooden cross is almost silhouetted against the big window. On the far side of the arches is the choir area where the friars would have sat in stalls on either side, would have been chanting like Gregorian chanting, singing and praying. Mass taking place up at the high altar, all in Latin, and you get the smell of the incense burner, the incense going up to the sky, the symbol of our prayers going up to heaven. It would all create a very almost mystical, heavenly, serene scene as you would come in here. So it was, it would have been a very special sight when you come in here on a summer's morning and look in that direction. Building mostly made of limestone, some sandstone around the windows. The original 13th century wall here, and for their mortar, they would have used sand, lime, crushed seashells. They would have used material like ox blood or animal blood, which helps the mixture to set or coagulate, and also they used material like horsehair or animal hair. And about 2 years ago, we had on a tour here, there was a guy on the tour who told us he operated a huge concrete business in Florida in the United States. He was very interested to hear about that back in the 13th century, they were using material like animal hair and horsehair in their mortar. When we think of reinforced concrete, we think of steel, all very well if it's done properly and the oxygen doesn't get in and it doesn't start to corrode and crack the concrete and so forth. And more and more of a use being made of fibrous materials in mortar, which gives it the strength but also gives it the flexibility. The friars were doing it here, the builders were doing it here hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So an example of not being too quick off the mark and describing them as unsophisticated, but teaches a lot of things. The Dominicans who were here, the first Dominicans would have been most likely Englishmen, but very soon there would have been Irishmen who became members of the order here. This was not an isolated, cut-off place on the northwest of Ireland, the edge of Europe. People might think it was remote, isolated and so forth. That was not the case. As I said, the people who are here, you have people speaking English, people speaking Irish. They all spoke Latin for their services. Latin was the language of aristocrats, it was the language of important documents. You also had people here from France and Spain. You had guys here speaking French and Spanish. They travelled from here to probably Bristol in England and on to the continent of Europe. Again, we might think we're great Europeans today. Again, the guys here were as much clued into what was happening on the greater European continent as we are today. So rather than being a cut-off place, they were very much in tune with what was happening in Europe. And the sea was their highway, the sea wasn't a barrier. So, as I said, that worked in some very practical ways as well. I mentioned about the Dominicans being communicators. Today there would be great networkers. They knew how to, there would be influencers. They helped bring people together, and on a very practical level, just a little anecdote of how that might happen. If you were a merchant in Sligo in the medieval times, And let's say you wanted to expand your business in northern Italy. A very good idea would be come in here, ask to speak to the prior, tell him what you were thinking of going to do. He would probably send you off, tell you come back in a week. By then he probably would have a nice letter written in Latin, and you could bring that letter to the prior in Milan or Bologna or wherever, and that letter would probably say, written by the prior or the prior here in Sligo, I know this guy, he's honest, he pays his bills, you can trust him, you can do business with him, and the word would go round in, as I say, Milan, Bologna or wherever. So, you know, the kind of, just like a letter of reference. So they, you know, they would have communicated with everybody from the upper echelons of society right down to the very bottom. They knew their manners, they knew their etiquette, they knew how to behave. Actually, when St. Dominic was traveling through France with his bishop, he was on a very strange errand. He was actually going to Denmark to try and arrange a marriage for a prince in Spain at the time. So it's kind of an unworldly maybe trip, but that was just shows you how they operated, you know, in a kind of almost secular and religious sphere. And the Dominicans, they were what we call mendicants. If they needed something, they went out and begged for it. They were different to other orders in that they did not have landed wealth. They were not tied down by landed wealth, as it were. So that made them quite mobile. So they could move wherever they were needed. You know, if you have abbeys, some abbeys became very powerful, some abbots became very powerful, owned very large amounts of land. There was in some abbeys there was a need for stability and so forth. The friars were different. They were mobile. They could move to wherever they were had to be sent, and that was an advantage for them as well. And that was something that helped them spread very rapidly throughout Europe, and particularly in Anglo-Norman towns, you know, along the east coast, Drogheda, Dublin, Wexford, so forth. And later on, as I said, they came to the northwest here and to places like Sligo. So we have people standing here, as I say, in the listening to the mass and the prayers at the front altar. The church was very successful. They built an aisle to accommodate more people, which is right behind you here. And it's very interesting to look at the very, perhaps rough exterior of the walls here compared to the much finer finish on the stonework here on the pillars of the aisle behind them. And of course, again, an example of the spiritual and the practical coming together. If you build an aisle, you're going to have an altar at the front of the aisle. If you have an altar, you're going to have more masses and more prayers and more services. If you have more prayers and more masses and more services and so forth, you have more people coming in, and if you have more people coming in, you're going to have more money. So there's always a practical explanation. So we move from this public area towards the roof street.